What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Bass Fishing Declassified. In this video, I'm going to explain how bass move in the wintertime on 3 completely different lake types. We're going to start here on Table Rock Lake in Arkansas, which is a clear highland reservoir. Table Rock Lake is, again, very clear on the lower end, sometimes getting as clear as 8 to 10 feet of visibility in the winter. There are some sections of the lake on the upper end and some of these creeks that will get dirtier, let's say 3 to 4 feet of visibility, but usually you're dealing with pretty clear water across the board. When you have a really clear lake like this, the bass are going to be setting up a little bit different from your standard lowland reservoirs or river systems, which we'll cover later in this video. Now, my understanding of how bass move in the wintertime on these highland reservoirs has changed a lot over the past few years. Initially, when I started fishing these types of reservoirs, I had the misconception that I needed to be fishing more on the main lake. It's cold, this is where the deepest water is, and I thought that if I got in these main lake areas, I was going to have the best chance of catching fish. And while you can catch fish on the main lake and in the first half of creeks, I find that I have the best success when I move back into the back third of a lot of these creeks on lakes like Table Rock. So what I'm going to do is basically go into one of these major creeks. I'll just pick this one right here because I've used it in a past video about how bass move. Now, as we take a closer look at the back half of this creek, you'll notice that it's still pretty deep in the middle, anywhere from 40 to 60 feet of water, depending on the water level. And what I find is that this is where a lot of the bass are going to be spawning in the springtime as water temperatures warm up. So once you hit 60-degree water temperatures, fish are going to pull into these shallower pockets, even just down some of these banks, and you can catch a lot of fish in these areas in April, May, and even into June in the post-spawn. But in the winter, these fish are not going to set up that far from where they're going to spawn. I think this is a big misconception I had when I was younger growing up. I thought that these fish were going to be, again, more towards the main lake and then making a move into these creeks as water temperatures warmed up through February, March, and April. But what I've found recently, over the past couple of years, is that there's so many fish that just live right basically in the dead center of these channels right here that are sitting there waiting for the water temperatures to warm up till they move into their pre-spawn locations. So the pre-spawn locations in this particular creek would be the secondary points and flatter stretches, even just kind of these flatter banks here. And the fish will set up in anywhere from 10 to 25 feet of water on brush piles, rock piles, any sort of cover that's out here. And they're going to be on these flatter areas that are raised up off the bottom. Again, points, humps, flats. But in the wintertime, these fish are actually just going to be out in front of these areas in these depressions or drains or ditches, whatever you want to call them. These drains or ditches are just old creek channels that are feeding these pockets. And I find that the majority of the bass that I'm catching nowadays in the wintertime are in these drains and ditches. Now, you may be thinking that I'm talking about catching fish with forward-facing sonar, chasing suspended fish on bait. And while you can catch fish doing that in the backs of these creeks, I actually catch a lot of fish without forward-facing sonar using traditional 2D sonar or just by dropping waypoints and graphing these areas with my 2D and downscan views. You can find fish very easily on traditional 2D and downscan sonar by graphing through these drains and depressions. You want to be looking a lot deeper though than you might expect. I find a lot of my fish in anywhere from 35 to 50 feet of water. And you kind of have to base where you're looking on the water level at that given time. When the water levels are lower, the fish are going to be further out towards the main part of this creek, or actually the main creek channel that feeds the bigger creek. But as the water levels are higher, or if they're just higher for whatever reason that year, the fish are going to be further back into these little cuts and drains, closer to the backs of these secondary pockets and secondary points. I find that these fish will stay here for a pretty good while, for months at times actually, and right about now in January through about the third week of March, the fish will set up in the same general zone, and if you can find a little area that's loaded up with fish, you can catch them here in the winter, catch them as they come up here to pre-spawn, and then catch them as they move back in here to spawn. And these fish kind of just set up in different little stretches year after year. What's interesting is that one year you might find there's a bunch of fish stacked up in this creek here, and then the next year there's no fish in this creek, and then this creek over here has a lot more fish, or this creek. And so you have to check a bunch of these creeks to figure out which ones are actually holding a concentration of fish. The way I do that again is just getting into these little drains and ditches and graphing them with 2D sonar down imaging, looking for fish that are sitting close to the bottom. I'm actually looking for fish that are within 2 to 3 feet of the bottom, if not glued to the bottom. And a lot of times they're very hard to see with traditional downscan sonar, and I have to use 2D sonar to look for the arches on the bottom of the lake, and they may even look like rocks to you if you're not that familiar with looking for fish on 2D sonar on the bottom. And I've had videos on my Fish at the Moment YouTube channel showing me doing this exact pattern before, so check out those videos from a couple years back in January, and then I'll also be doing a lot more on Fish at the Moment this year, doing the exact same techniques. So I'll get into these little drains, ditches, any place where you have these depressions where the bottom of the lake is a little bit deeper or drops off a little bit, and you want to be in the middle of those depressions, not on the tops of the points, in the depressions, graphing around. And if you find a little group of them, it might take a while of graphing. Sometimes it takes me 2 to 3 hours at times to graph up a good group of fish. But usually you're going to catch like 15 to 20 fish when you find one of these. It's a really good pattern for putting numbers in the boat. I'll catch them on jigging spoons, Demiki rigs, Alabama rigs if you are allowed to throw those in your tournaments, and you can absolutely smash them. Again, the key is just going into these areas, trying to find these fish that are in these depressions. Now, there are some fish that might just be setting up on these secondary points and things like that, and you can find a few fish here and there scattered. You can also find some fish on steeper bluff walls, bluff ends, things like that. Those are more traditional winter spots, but I would say that the majority of the fish I'm catching nowadays are in these little drains and things like that, and I'm catching 30, 40, 50 fish a day at times doing this. This isn't just like a few fish pattern. This is many fish per day pattern, and it turns winter fishing from a grind of getting 3 to 5 bites a day, 8 bites a day, into a smash fest of catching 30, 40, 50 fish a day. Just graph a bunch of these little drains and cuts. You may have to graph 20 of them before you find a group of fish, but when you do, it is game on. So that is what I would do on these highland clear reservoirs like a Table Rock. Really quick, guys, if you enjoy the content on Bass Fishing Declassified, you'll definitely like the lake breakdowns we offer at fishthemoment.com. These breakdowns provide different looks at your lake and give you 40 detailed waypoints on areas to fish, whether you're fishing shallow, northern lakes, or offshore. These breakdowns are by season, so you can pick a season and then go and find your lake here, and you're going to get detailed instructions on the conditions, the baits, and the strategies to employ on these different waypoints to put you around the fish every single time you head to the lake. Definitely check out these lake breakdowns at fishthemoment.com. Next, let's take a look at Grand Lake in Oklahoma. This lake is a lot shallower and muddier than Table Rock, with an average visibility of 1 to 3 feet. It also has a lot of non-bass species in it, like drum and catfish, which make it really hard to kind of target fish with forward-facing sonar or just graph them on the bottom with down imaging 2D sonar, things like that. You can do it at times on the lower end of the lake when it gets clear, let's say 4+ feet of visibility, and there are fish that you can catch using the strategies from the last lake type I showed you. But in general, I try to avoid those strategies because there's just fewer fish setting up like that. And I'm still going to use similar methodology, at least in the sense that I want to be close to the spawning areas. On Table Rock, I try to get in the back half of these creeks, out in front of the spawning bays and pockets and pre-spawn areas, and fish kind of more in the middle of the ditches and drains. Again, you can do this on these lakes, but you're just going to have to spend a lot more time graphing to find them. They're not easy to find, and that is proof from the Bassmaster Classic last year, this time in the winter-ish time. There weren't really any guys that found that pattern other than maybe a couple. So the predominant pattern out here was actually to do what I'm about to explain, which is instead try to find flatter spawning areas like flat bays, flat banks, or areas around islands. And what you're looking for are places where these bass can set up and winter pretty much all winter long before moving up into their pre-spawn areas, which are going to be basically halfway in between, and then the spawning areas. And I'll explain what all this is here on the map. So this is an area where a lot of damage was done during the Bassmaster Classic it was kind of, I would say, the late winter time last year. It was pretty cold in the Arkansas, Oklahoma area, so I would say it was like kind of late winter when those guys were fishing here. And a lot of the fish were being caught in winter and pre-spawn areas. So the pre-spawn areas are basically little brush piles and hard spots in anywhere from, let's say, 6 to 10 feet of water around a lot of these islands. And they're just kind of out here on these flatter banks that look like almost nothing. You might think, what's going on out here? Well, there's a lot of, like, again, random rock piles, random little points of rock, humps, things like that that are barely visible on the map. There's like a little hump right here, a little hump right there, and that's what those fish will pre-spawn on. But in the winter time, when it's colder, they'll be sitting just a little bit deeper, basically as deep as they can get, where the sun still penetrates in the water and warms up the cover they can fish. Or I mean the cover that they can sit in and that we can fish. And this is all based on the water clarity. So on this section of Grand Lake, a lot of times you'll have like 2 to 3 foot of water visibility. And that means that sun can penetrate and warm up objects anywhere from, let's say, 12 to 20 feet of water depending on the day. And then as you get dirtier, let's say a foot of water, that sun can only penetrate maybe down to like 8 or 10 feet of water. And so the fish are going to be setting up shallower the muddier the water goes. And I like to try to fish in the areas that are like 10 to 20 feet deep and hunt out that like 2 to 3 foot of water visibility. I find those fish are the easiest to catch, and those fish that are in really dirty water, a foot or less of visibility, can be pretty tricky to catch at times just for their lack of visibility. And I'm targeting a lot of these fish with jerk baits and jigs and baits that I need to move really slow to kind of entice them to bite. And so having a little bit of water visibility or a little bit clearer water visibility does help you get a few more bites. But basically I'm going to then go out in front of all of these islands, all of these flatter banks, and I'm going to graph around in that 10, 12, 15 foot of water range, maybe even out to 20 feet if you have clear enough water, and just look for isolated pieces of cover that are kind of out by themselves. You want to find isolated rock piles, isolated brush piles, isolated stump rows, just kind of out here randomly out in front of these spawning zones. The fish will move up here to spawn later in the year. They'll move up into these islands to spawn, things like that. And a lot of the spots I'm going to find are just kind of out here randomly. There's like a little foundation or something here, but they're just going to be kind of out in these general flatter zones. I'm not looking necessarily in these little drains or depressions as much, though you can find some bait and things suspended around there at times. But instead, I'm looking kind of on the edges of these drains where the deeper water connects to the shallower water on points like this, or just way out here on these flats. It seems kind of crazy. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of rhyme or reason to it, but again, the fish are spawning out here or spawning up here on this island, and all they're trying to do is sit as close as they possibly can to these spawning grounds while being in as deep a water as they can, where they can still get some sunlight and where they can kind of feel protected from that cold, chilly water at the surface. So anywhere like right in through here, 15 to 20 feet, if you can find some brush, if you can find some rock, throw a jig, Alabama rig, jerkbait, things like that, and you're going to get some bites. And that's kind of how I handle a lot of these types of lakes. There's a ton of water like this around the lake. There's different sections that are flatter. There's different sections that are steeper. I prefer the flatter creeks where at least there's some flat water sticking out, though you can catch fish doing the exact same thing in some of the steeper sections of these lakes as well. But basically what you're going to be doing is something similar. You're going to be fishing areas out in front of spawning zones. So like here's a steep bank right here, or a steep bank right here, right in front of a spawning pocket or a spawning creek. And these fish are going to be setting up in that same exact deal, that 10 to 20 foot of water range. But instead of being way out in the middle of the lake like I showed you earlier, they're just going to be in 10 to 15 feet of water on these steeper banks. So you'll want to work your jigs, Alabama rigs, crankbaits, jerkbaits in that 10 to 20 foot range on these steeper banks, and try to keep your boat and your casts in a way that you're maintaining your bait in those depth zones rather than trying to fish right up against the bluff walls or the steeper banks. And ideally, you're just fishing the banks that are right out in the mouth of these spawning bays, spawning pockets. That's kind of the idea here. So this bank right here, you would want to be fishing this stretch right here because it's between two spawning pockets, and keeping your bait in that 10 to 15 foot zone, 10 to 20 foot zone. So that's kind of how you do it against the bank, and that's really my strategy for these dirtier water lakes, these lowland. This isn't really a lowland reservoir, this is still kind of a highland reservoir, but at least dirtier lakes that have a lot of water flow and maybe don't have as pretty images on the graph screen where maybe you have a bunch of clutter on your screen, you just see a bunch of stuff floating around, a bunch of drum and catfish and stuff like that. This is kind of the strategy for these lakes. Last but not least, let's take a look at a true river system type lake. This is Lake Dardanelle in Arkansas. It's actually a pool on the Arkansas River, and on the upper end of the pool you have very much river-like elements. It's just a river with a bunch of creeks in it. And I like to try to fish as far towards the lower dam as possible on any of these pools of the Arkansas River. Lake Dardanelle is a little bit unique because it is a little bit wider in portions, but the same rules apply regardless of which pool you're fishing. The main key on these fisheries is trying to find the cleanest water that you possibly can in the surrounding zones. You don't necessarily need to find clear water, you just need to find the clearest water that you can find. So I have a couple of images here, and we have some extreme examples with also some less extreme examples. But if we take a look, this is an image from January 29th, 2024. And so this is the Illinois Bayou area, and you can see that the main Illinois Bayou area is pretty dirty. It's not like super dirty in this image. I would say you are looking at like a foot and a half visibility. But then in some of these little protected creeks that are protected by bridges, you have a lot cleaner water in through here, and especially as you get back more into the Illinois Bayou itself. And then all of a sudden you see this super clear water that's just popping out. And these are actually old strip pits. They're super clear water. And these are historically really good places to catch fish in the winter time on Lake Dardanelle. But I actually try to avoid these types of areas just because they get so much fishing pressure. And instead of trying to find the most obvious clear water areas, especially if you have those in your fishery, I try to find the areas that have a little bit less obvious clear water. And that's going to be a place, for example, like Dardanelle Bay here. So you can see there's a pretty hard mud line with the water coming into this backwater, and then it gets a lot clearer. And what I find in the wintertime is that if you can find that transition zone from where it goes from really dirty water to slightly clear water and then the clearest water, that's where I'm going to catch a lot of my fish on these river system lakes or just river systems in general. And the key zone for me is actually going to be right in here where that water is mixing. So if I had to draw kind of an area around here, it would be kind of this zone right here. And these bass are going to be following these mud lines. And the reason they follow the mud lines on these river system type lakes or just river systems in general is that's where a lot of the nutrients are. The dirtier water in the silt is actually going to bring in nutrients, which is going to attract shad or bait fish. And so there's going to be a lot of bait fish in these areas. It'll actually concentrate them really well. And even though there's clearer water back in the back of this bay, a lot of the bait fish will pull to this fresh water coming into this creek. And you're going to find that you'll get the majority of your fish and the majority of your bait fish setting up in this zone I circled here. Now, in terms of the areas I fish, I honestly don't get that picky about it on these river systems because the fish don't set up super deep most of the time anyways. I'll just kind of get on a lot of these secondary points. There's actually some steeper, bluffier, rockier banks right here. And I'll throw jerk baits, Alabama rigs, crankbaits, and jigs through these areas. And on these river systems, these fish are so used to living shallow that if you get a warm day, they may even pull up on some of these laydowns and some of these docks, and you can catch them on spinner baits or catch them on a, just flipping a jig or on boat docks. So I'm not super worried about trying to fish like offshore or fish super deep. Mainly, I'm just looking for these areas where the water is mixing, and that's kind of going to be my key. If we go back up here a little bit more, you can see a similar scenario happening. This is from December 3rd, 2023 up here. And same exact situations happening in Piney Bay here. So Piney, you can see the actual chute is really, really dirty for some reason. I don't know why it's so dirty right now, but there's kind of clearer water actually in the mouth of this and then dirtier water here. If we take a look, you can actually see there's a pile of boats like right in here. And the reason I think that there's people stacked up here and there's probably fish stacked up here is that transition from dirtier water to clear water. Now in this case, the main river is the clear water and the creek is actually the dirty water, which can happen. And that's kind of a weird scenario, but I've seen it happen many times on these river systems. And so the area that I would be focused on is actually right here in these three bridges where you have riprap and things, just because there's clearer water right here mixing with the dirtier. It's going to attract a lot of bait fish and you're going to have a concentration of bass. Same thing happens on the other side of this. So as you kind of get through here, you can see that, again, waves of muddy water mixing with some clear water from the back of this creek. This zone right here, kind of circle it again, is going to be your key zone that I would be focused on. Fishing any of these banks, any of these points, just this zone right here is going to be a good stretch because it has that mixing water. Now, aerial footage obviously always helps with this, but you can also just get in these areas. And I'll just run around a lot of times in these creeks, and you can visually see the change. It's not super hard to see these changes when you're out there on the lake, but it does pay to run around the lake and look around for some of these things. And you don't always have to, again, find the cleanest water. Finding the cleanest water a lot of times is actually, in my opinion, overrated, because if there's clear water everywhere, you don't know kind of where you need to be fishing. And if you can find these transition areas, it really dials those fish into those changes in water visibility, congregates the bait fish, and it makes it a lot easier to kind of locate where you need to be fishing. So that's kind of what I do on these river systems. This is, again, more of like a major river system. The same thing can apply if you go down to other pools that have less of these like giant backwaters. So here's a pool on in the Maumelle pool down by Little Rock. And if we take a look, this is like a, let me see if I can find an image from the winter. There we go. Here's like a February image. Same concepts apply. So you have areas that are maybe just a little bit dirtier or clearer. Let's kind of look through and just see if we can find any. So like in through here, you can see this is a perfect example right there. You have really dirty water meeting some clear water. This is going to be one of those zones you want to be checking out. It has that really hard break right there. And a lot of these boat docks are probably going to be pretty good if you can fish those. If you can't fish those, then maybe just out in front here might be a good area. And then you continuing to look for those types of areas throughout, even in stretches like on these big creeks like this, where you have really muddy water transitioning into a little bit clearer water. That could be a player right there. So just trying to give you guys an idea that, you know, regardless of which river system you're on, you're usually going to find scenarios like this, though they're not all over the place. I'm just kind of going through this area, and it's not like there's a million of these transition zones. They're like even 8-10 of them. A lot of times there's just a couple, and that's where a lot of the good fishing is going to be. So you really have to pay attention, run different creeks, and just kind of bounce around to look for that clarity to find the best water. So anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and learned something about how bass move in the wintertime on a few different bodies of water. If you guys enjoyed, make sure you leave a comment down below. Also like the video. We'll see you guys in the next episode.